So in accelerating science, regulation is a key tool to control and facilitate technological innovation into practice in healthcare. So has the FDA adapted in any way during this global crisis to allow accelerated paths for innovative approaches, drugs, vaccines, to fit the urgent global needs?
I think that there are several areas of change. So first is that we have put in place a number of types of regulatory flexibility. I think of this as regulatory agility, and the need is to be able to move medical products through as quickly as possible, provided that we have some confidence around safety and efficacy, effectiveness, or what we would expect in terms of the performance of the product. And to do so by, for example, putting new guidances in place that are relevant to the current COVID-19 context. So they're essentially pandemic-specific guidances that say, here's how we're going to operate. Sometimes we do this by stating enforcement discretion. So we recognize that under normal circumstances, we would enforce a certain scenario, but right now we're going to remain quiet. And also by stimulating the development of new products that are needed within the context of the market. So for example, that changes in ventilators to make sure we have enough ventilators in the market. Now, importantly, there's a second part of the innovation that goes along with regulatory agility. And that is that if we're going to have more regulatory flexibility to promote innovation, we also need a mechanism to cross-check, right? To back up and say, how are things going with our current regulatory paradigm within the context of COVID-19? And do we need to either speed up or pull back? And a good example of that is what happened with serology tests in the United States, where we approved a number of diagnostic tests through emergency use authorizations, and then ultimately needed to pull back on many of those tests on the market because they're not performing as expected. So that's kind of an example of the second way that we do this. The third is, you may be curious about technology. This is sort of a future medicine focused conversation. And we are using data and technology in a number of ways to spur innovation and do our work better within the context of COVID-19. So for example, we're thinking about the use of real-world data, not just to understand the performance of medical products, but also real-world data to help us understand what's the natural history of COVID-19 so that we know how is the pandemic changing and how do we need to push forward the development of new medical products. We're thinking about real-world data to help us understand, for example, medical product supply chains and potential areas of drug or PPE shortages. So we're using data in totally new ways to solve for the pandemic, and it's teaching us about what we can do for the future. Similarly, we're using new data visualization techniques in that kind of way. We're thinking about the role of AI, et cetera. So there's lots of ways that we're trying to bring data and technology to the innovation space to support the pandemic as well.
So what are the plans for the immediate future, and which of these pathways will remain in place after the crisis is over and help us to continue accelerating science?
So I think that the most important part is we're going to maintain that framework of thinking about where we can have regulatory agility and also cross-checking. So that includes in the diagnostic space, the rest of the medical device space for us, as well as in therapeutics and the development of vaccines. And so the first is we recognize that in order to fight the pandemic, we need to push hard in all of those directions. And so we will continue to both focus on appropriate regulatory flexibility as well as right-sizing it as we go along and we learn. You also asked another important question, or at least I think was embedded in what you asked, which is how is what we're learning also going to sort of speak to the future? And, we have a commitment to learning from what's happening right now. And let me give you an example within the context of clinical trials. I think around the world, what we've seen is many of the ongoing clinical trials for non-COVID therapeutics, for example, come to a halt. And that is not good because we still need the appropriate development of medical products to fight the diseases we were fighting before COVID-19, right? And so we've been thinking hard about what can we do to continue to stimulate the ongoing activity of clinical trials? What were prior guidances and actions we had already taken that we want to bring to the forefront? And then also, what are new actions that we want to put into place in the context of the pandemic in order to support clinical trials right now, but also learn from what's happening about how do we also conduct clinical trials in the future. And so some examples of that are that we had prior guidances that spoke to, for example, the use of remote monitoring via telemedicine and wanting to be able to understand how to do that. Now that's becoming real in COVID-19. And what we will do now is also stop to understand how does remote monitoring and telemedicine play into the integrity of clinical trial data, and what might that look like for us in the future. Similarly, we've put in regulatory flexibility around the availability of investigational products, for example, the study drug, and the ability for patients to get it from their local doctor as opposed to having to travel across the country to get study drug. And then as the pandemic unfolds and we get past the pandemic, we will stop and study that and understand what does that do in terms of safety. How can we understand that kind of regulatory flexibility and its role in the future? And so we're using the innovations that need to be put in place right now to tell us what does the innovation need to look like in the future.
I see. I wonder if you had to guesstimate what would be the likely horizon in terms of an effective vaccine becoming available in the US in specific and any other country. What would be I would say a fair assessment of what the time horizon we could expect?
So I don't think I can give you an accurate time horizon. I don't have a crystal ball, and I suspect probably you don't either. But practically speaking, I can say that we're all working as quickly as possible. You've probably heard about Operation Warp Speed in the United States, which is really a all of government full force effort to try and develop vaccines and also other medical products, and to make sure that we're not only developing the vaccines, but planning for their manufacturing and distribution now, because historically these things have happened one after the other, which means that the timeline is dependent not only on the development of the vaccine, but the manufacturing process and the distribution process, and how can we already plan and speed that up along the way. The other thing is we're planning on making sure that as a vaccine becomes available, we're already thinking about what kinds of additional data will we need, additional safety monitoring, et cetera, across time. When will all this come to fruition? I don't really know. I don't know, is that a 2020, end of 2020 timeline? Is it a 2021 timeline? I personally ultimately want to make sure that what we're doing is keep pushing hard and fast, but we also keep our eyes on safety and effectiveness.
Maybe one last question. There's a whole lot of use of AI these days for various purposes. One of the fields people continuously in these discussions that we have to this conference have mentioned as an important or potential revolutionary step is drug repurposing and drug redesign using AI and various sources of data that would allow us to get something for COVID-19. Do you share that sentiment that there's a good chance that this approach might lead to more rapid, more meaningful innovation in practice?
So I certainly am hopeful. And it goes to my area where I think we've already seen some aspects of drug repurposing play into a positive story. The dexamethasone story is a really great example of drug repurposing in the context of COVID-19. How does AI come into this? And I see a number of ways. One is it helps us sort through all the many potential available drugs for repurposing and ask the question, where might there be a good match that then can be pushed through in more traditional development methods. Another place that AI has a role that's going to help, I think, to speed this up is to help us really get data sets cleaned up and better ready to be able to be used to understand how these drugs are performing. And so I see a role for AI there. I also see a role for AI to help us get smarter about conducting operational tasks and essentially performing a role within the context of robotic automation and other artificial intelligence-based activities. Do I wish there would have been a sort of a eureka aha and many different AI solutions would have come to bear? I think we all do. Do I think we're sitting on the precipice of many different ways that data technology and advanced analytics, including artificial intelligence, are really going to push us into the future? Absolutely. And so really one of the core tasks is to figure it out now and then figure out what that's going to tell us about our future.